The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society presents this special program recorded on June 7th, 2025, in the virtual reality space of the Foremothers Café. Helen Lundström Erwin hosted us in her VR space inspired by the research she conducted for her book, Sour Milk in Sheep's Wool. She invited our members to a discussion of images provided by authors Loretta Goldberg, Faith L. Justice, and Sarah Relyea. They talked about the images and their relationships to their books, social customs dealing with marriage and gay-lesbian relationships in the times they write about, and much more. A fascinating program for our writers and readers alike. Information about our chapter is available at our website, HNS-NYC.org. Link listed in the description, along with our participants, their books, and their links. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Welcome to the Foremothers Café, everyone. It's a real honor for me to have the Historical Novel Society here at the Foremothers Café. Welcome.
Faith, it's so nice to have you here. Welcome to the Foremothers Café. You have two beautiful photographs of paintings behind you. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me, Helen. I was looking forward to this. Yeah, one of the things about doing historical novels that's really, really fun is doing site visits. So going to look at locations that are in your books. The problem with doing ancient historical fiction is that most of those sites are gone. They've been built over. You go someplace that's of historical significance and there will be a brass plaque on a modern building. But I was lucky enough that because I write in the Roman Empire, a lot of the stuff is still around. So if you take a look at the photograph that has mostly red, it looks like it's a painting, but it's actually a fresco from Pompeii. Pompeii, lucky for us, very unlucky for the Pompeians, was basically covered up in lava from an eruption from Vesuvius in the 1st century, which basically saved it for us. It is like a time capsule, and it is filled with all kinds of interesting artifacts and tons of art. And one of the art periods in Pompeii, there supposedly were 3 or 4, was the Red period. And this fresco is an excellent example of the Red period. And it is made to look like, you could walk into a garden. So you notice the columns on the right and a little fountain in the front. And then you could, it's supposed to look like you could walk outside the house into a garden. So, very lucky to get that, and all kinds of excellent artifacts in Pompeii. If you ever get the opportunity to go to Italy, definitely check out Herculaneum and Pompeii. Then Then the other picture, which is the blue, which has Jesus as a shepherd holding his cross with the sheep around him. So this is Jesus as the Good Shepherd. This is set in the 5th century. This is from Ravenna. And by then, the pagan gods of the 1st century of Rome had given way to Christianity. Christianity was the state religion. And this is from the mausoleum of Galla Placidia. Galla Placidia was an empress in the 5th century. She was the daughter of Theodosian the Great. And she had a really, really interesting life history. She was captured by the Goths during the siege of Rome. They kept her hostage for 5 years. She married their king. After his death, she came back to Rome and married another general and became empress, and then was the mother of Valentinian III. She actually is also the main character in a couple of my books, a novella called Becoming the Twilight Empress and Twilight Empress, which I had written first. So I was studying her life very closely, and it was a delight to go to Ravenna, which was the seat of Rome, the Roman Empire at the time. Rome had become a little bit of a backwater. And so I got to see these remarkably preserved mosaics and churches from this time period. Now, it also happens to be a really interesting fact in that the mausoleum of Galla Placidia was, in fact, not her mausoleum. That became the name of this chapel sometime during the Renaissance, when Ravenna was touting itself to pilgrims and trying to get tourists to come and look at their collection of really well-preserved 5th century mosaics and churches. So when I went in, I didn't know this, and the gift shop had, you know, all the good stuff about Galla Placidia and the time, and you know, and her sad story, and you know, and how this was her place. And there were 3 sarcophagi laid out. One was supposed to be hers, one was supposed to be her husband's, her second husband's, and the other was supposed to be her brother, who was Honorius the first he was an emperor of Rome. But later, as I was doing my research, because you need to do that to confirm all these things, I found out that no, she was not buried in this. It was most likely a chapel built by her son, Valentinian. She was buried in Rome in the imperial mausoleum, which was close to the martyrs, Peter and Paul, because that was something that everybody thought was very important. The closer you were buried to martyrs, the more holy you were, and the more likely you were to be able to get into heaven. And we know this because when that mausoleum was torn down to build the Basilica of St. Peter's in like the 11th or 12th century, they actually found a coffin that they thought was hers. In this sarcophagus, there was the remains of a woman. There was also a small silver casket having the remains of an infant. And it was known that Galla Placidia's firstborn died very young in Barcelona. And she had a large, when she came back to Rome, she had a very significant parade and reinterment of her son's remains in the imperial mausoleum. So even though her name wasn't on the sarcophagus, it's very, very certain that that was her burial spot. So we still have these lovely, lovely mosaics, many all over Ravenna. And again, if you get the opportunity to go to Italy, stop by Ravenna and see all these remarkable pieces of art.
That's amazing. I went to Ravenna, but I didn't see those pieces of art. We were there just for a day or two, my husband and I, but it was gorgeous there. Thank you for telling us all of this. And you spoke a little bit about religion already, and that was one of the social customs questions I was wondering about. Do you want to start by talking about that a little bit and a little bit more, and then I'm thinking of asking you about other social customs also. But if you wanted to start with the religious bit, that'd be very interesting.
Okay. Yeah, Christianity had not quite made it to Rome. I mean, it was there, and because we know that Peter and Paul were martyred, like, you know, in the 30s or 40s, I forget. And and the Vesuvius erupted in the 60s, I think it was 63. I'm sorry, I'm a little vague on the exact dates, but in those basic time periods. But, you know, it was just getting a toehold. So, you know, the Jews had not yet been expelled from Jerusalem, so it was missionaries who were out and about at this time. The early Christianity is actually a fascinating thing, and I could talk for hours on that, so I'm not going to.
Okay.
But Peter, in Jerusalem, it had been decided that Peter would be the one who would take the word to the Jews. And he would go out and basically talk to already existing Jewish populations around Mediterranean, because the Jews were good traders. They had little colonies every place where they had commercial interests. And Paul, who thought that they shouldn't be keeping the word about Jesus and his remarkable resurrection only among Jews, wanted to proselytize to pagans. And the traditional Jewish group in Jerusalem said, we don't like this, but hey, if you go out and just stay among the pagans, we're fine. And so he went out and proselytized to those kinds of groups. And he did not require them to follow Jewish customs. So they did not have to get circumcised. They did not have to follow the laws of Moses. And that's what the Jewish council in Jerusalem objected to. But Paul was such a wonderful, wonderful minister, and he was indefatigable. I mean, he went everywhere, and wherever he went, he got all kinds of converts. And quite frankly, the Christian church as we know it is more Paul's church than Peter's. And, when you go and read the New Testament, there's all the letters from Paul to all his various communities, and they were non-Jewish communities. So that's where Christianity was at this time in its infancy. And
that's interesting.
And so over time, the church was persecuted, like in the 100s and the 200s, and got stronger and stronger. And then when Constantine came into power, was the emperor in the 300s, and he consolidated. And at the end of and he allowed Christianity to be observed. Up to that point in time, Christianity was not allowed. I mean, they persecuted people for worshiping. But primarily they persecuted them not because they worshiped Jesus and the Holy Spirit and whatever, but because they would not worship the local gods or the emperor. The emperor at this time was frequently deified. And so that was the most significant conflict. They didn't take part in local events and religious pageantry, which was a way of maintaining community, and they were considered outsiders because of this. So Constantine said, okay, we're going to allow Christianity. And also, right before he died, he got baptized, because the Christian church basically said, hey, if you're baptized, that gives you a clean slate. So I think he was kind of hedging his bets and saying, all right, I'll be baptized and cleansed of all the sins, just in case this Christian stuff is real. That's my interpretation, not any historians.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it also leads me to my next question about marriage, and if I may combine both marriage customs in your time period, and also it's Pride Month. So I'm also curious about what people in your time period thought about gay relationships. And if you could talk a little about both marriage in general and gay relationships and gay marriage at that time. I'm not sure if they had that concept, but I'm very curious if you could talk a little about both those things.
Sure. Basically in the more ancient times in Rome, they were pretty okay with anything. It wasn't taboo to have a relationship, among two men or two women, or have group sex orgies. Everybody knows the famous, Roman orgies. They had, I don't remember what the name is for men who engaged in male-to-male sex. The females, they were called tribades, Tribades. And the characters in my first century book, Sword of the Gladiatrix, were two women who weren't from Rome. One was from the country of Kush, which is where Sudan is now, and the other was from Britain. She was an Iceni warrior. And they both get enslaved. They get taken to Rome, and they meet and love there. But in their own particular places, this was kind of frowned upon. So they actually found some freedom in their enslavement, which again was an interesting twist. When you're talking about marriage was really only recognized among upper class people. Slaves could, I guess in the old way that we talk about it in the US, you could jump over the broom. I don't know what the custom was among slaves in Rome, but, man and woman could get together, woman and woman, man, man, whatever. They could get together, but there wasn't a marriage contract. There wasn't anything that was signed. And among the upper classes, marriage was considered basically a contract. You're talking about moving resources, land, money from trade, whatever. And in that time, the men basically had the upper hand like they normally do. The women rarely had any control over their own, any money they brought to the marriage. Some could contract to say that if they got divorced, they got their dowry back. So there were some documents about that. And so, it wasn't that different from up until just like 150, 200 years ago, in modern times. It was basically a social contract. The way that women could get some control over these sorts of things was when they became widows and didn't have sons. And in Pompeii, there was a very famous woman named Julia who ran her own bathhouse and associated brothel, and her stuff is all over the place. You'll see signs for Julia's women, and you can get a bed at her bathhouse and all this sort of stuff. So there were women who could get control. Now, in terms of when you look at upper class men and women and gay relationships, one of the things that I know is true is that men could, again, men of means, could adopt another adult man into his family and then leave all his stuff to him. So it wasn't marriage, it was adoption. And many what happened inside the house in the manor, who knows? But that was common. And in fact, there were the 5 good emperors, and each of the emperors adopted the other. Now that was for political reasons. So when one emperor was getting ready to die, he would find a good person who could come along and run the empire well, and then he would adopt him, and then that person would become emperor. There's not much in the way of again, women. We just don't know. One little tidbit in the early Roman times was that even though male-on-male relationships were fine, again, among the noble class, you had to be the dominant partner. And this comes from the Greeks, where the Greeks always had like an older man who would take a younger man and initiate him into society, and usually through sex. So the Romans had kind of adopted this. And Julius Caesar, there was a scandal about him in the early days because supposedly when he was in the East, he was in a relationship with a Parthian king, and I think it was Parthia, it might have been another king. And supposedly he was not the dominant partner. And so his enemies back in Rome, who were trying to keep him out of power, spread this rumor everywhere. And it very much damaged his reputation. And when he came back, he got revenge by basically sleeping with all his enemies' wives and daughters and sisters. And yeah, so I guess he slept his way to the top.
Wow. It's so amazing. There's so much history, and it is very, very interesting to hear about all this. Thank you so much for sharing. And it's fascinating to look further back in the past to learn how different it was from how different it was from what we expect of history. So thank you so much for sharing this. I think it's time for me to go over to Loretta. Welcome, Loretta. It's so nice to have you here at the Foremothers Café as well. You've written about a time period that is a lot later than faith. Can you, faith time period. Can you tell us a little bit about your photographs that you have behind you?
Thank you, Helen. Yes, I love being in the Foremothers Café. So I have two pictures here from World War II, Australia and Papua New Guinea, which was the setting of my novel Beyond the Bookaboo Tree. And let's talk about the sculpture first. I was inspired to write this novel by an uncle I never met, an Orthodox Jewish doctor who volunteered to join the Australian Army and was sent to Papua New Guinea. Now, the statue is by an Australian sculptor by the name of C. Webb Gilbert, Charles Webb Gilbert. He was born in the 1860s and he died in about the 1930s. He was born in a rural mining town called Cockatoo, which ironically is also the name of an Australian bird. But his father died when he was young, and he had to start making a living when he was 10. So he went to the main town in the south state of Australia, Victoria, Melbourne, which is my hometown. And he started in a hotel washing dishes. And then he discovered his real talent for things by styling weddings and banquets. He arranged tables so well that became his job. And he just moved directly from that without going to school into painting and sculpture. So without going to art school, he won local competitions and exhibitions and made some money doing that. World War I breaks out and he goes to London and is expecting to be drafted, but isn't. He goes to art school there. So he got formal training there, exhibited, won more contests, and then was hired as an army artist by the Australian Army. So this particular statue, I went back to Australia at the end of 2023 for its unveiling as a restored statue. It had fallen in disrepair. And it is a tribute to Australian army doctors who tended soldiers on the front line. It is meant to honor the fallen Australian doctors of World War I and World War II. And the names of each of the fallen doctors are inscribed on the banner around the base. So there were 41 Aussie doctors who fell in World War I and 32 in World War II. And my uncle's name is among the World War II ones. So this statue is so awesome. It's hard to convey how moving it is if you haven't gone right up to it and touched it. The folds of the soldier's fabric, they're bronze, but they look incredibly soft and realistic. You can see the concern and the focus in the doctor who's got the helmet on as he bends over the wounded, anguished soldier. So it's a timeless piece.
Wow, beautiful.
So that is the first. Now the other one is a battle scene from the same novel set in Papua New Guinea. And the name of the beach is Vulcan Beach, V-U-L-C-A-N, and this scene took place on January the 23rd, 1942. My uncle, who was the protagonist of my novel, whom I'm fictionalized, was the only army doctor at this battle in the regimental aid post. So the Australian Army declared war on Germany the moment that Britain did in 1939. They had 4 professional army divisions and sent 3 over to fight for Mother England in the Middle East and Europe. They kept 1 at home to defend the homeland. Now, Australia is geographically almost as large as the United States. So you can imagine that 20,000 professional soldiers aren't going to go very far if there's a true invasion. But Australia had also many mandated territories that they administered as a colonial power after World War I that had been taken from the German and Japanese. So they were responsible for not fortifying them in the build-up to the war, unlike the Japanese who fortified all their mandates. And then suddenly they began to realize, oh, Japan is a threat. So they raised volunteer garrisons in 1941 and sent very small units to each of these spread out territories. Papua New Guinea was one of them. The Northern Island, New Britain Island, has about 2,000-mile coastline, and its capital, Rabaul, which is where the action is set, hosted the greatest harbor in the southern Pacific, but in the southern hemisphere. Below the equator, Rabaul was it in terms of great shipping, and it was Japan's #1 strategic objective. So to meet this strategic objective, the Australians sent 1,400, one battalion, sorry for that noise, and my uncle was among them, one of 4 army doctors and the last to retreat. So that particular battle took about 5 hours, but 280 Australians with World War I guns, ammos, and mortars held off 5,000 Japanese and inflicted about 30% casualties. And the Japanese had planes, the Australian Air Force was decimated at this point, and they had warships, and the Australian Navy had scampered. So that was really the story of Vulcan Beach. And my uncle, as I said, was the only army doctor, at that particular battle.
Wow. And that's so interesting. And your own family members too, your uncle, must have been a very moving experience to write that book and write about this. And since I was asking Faith before about social customs and marriage customs in her time period, could you talk a little bit about the social customs in your time period and your time periods, and specifically relationships and marriage?
Sure. I won't really talk about marriage because it was the middle 20th century, and I think we all know how parents and grandparents lived. But I will talk about the state of gay relationships at that time. I made a choice to make my 2 protagonists in my novel, my fictionalized uncle and an army officer he met on the way to Rabaul and served with. I gave them a love relationship. And there's another forbidden relationship in the novel between a mixed-race Chinese-Australian sailor who'd suffered a great deal of racist bashing by the Australians, and the daughter of a native Tolai, T-O-L-A-I was the name of the tribe, Tolai chief. And so those 2 relationships are how the war is experienced. Rabaul was a colonial mixture. It was apartheid in the sense of populations living separately with separate hospitals, but they were totally interdependent. Tolai were the majority of 3,000. There were 1,000 Chinese who were in the business community, and 1,000 Australian administrators with the 1,400 soldiers. And I have had them all have interrelationships as the war got started. In terms of gay relationships, it was forbidden, it was frowned on, but in the mainland of New Guinea, there were so many relationships that the American Army and the Australian Army at that time were investigating them. They got reports and they changed the rules. Before that, it was really the British rule, which is it was against the rules, but the unit commander decided to whether to ignore it or if it was against customs, against morale. after the Americans and the Australians investigated what was happening in the mainland New Guinea, which is a year after what happened in Rabaul, they came up with new rules that were much more strict about automatic discharge and legal punishment. So that was really the context. And my feeling is that gay soldiers contributed as much as anybody else. And I wanted to honor them. And in terms of my own uncle, I do not know his situation, but he was an Orthodox Jewish, handsome doctor who never married and never showed any interest in girls. So I have given him what I suspect possibly he might have wanted.
Yeah, yeah. It's so interesting to see how times change throughout history, and how Faith was talking about the ways people could be together that loved each other, and the way it was in her time period. And then in your time period, much, much later, everything changed. And even if your uncle had a relationship, he could never tell anyone. But your interpretation is probably, I feel, probably right. I think your gut was telling you that he loved somebody that he couldn't talk of. So thank you so much for sharing this. When it comes to religious practices in your time period, it was, how was that? You said your uncle was an Orthodox Jewish man, and did you come across a lot of his religious beliefs in your research? Did you know more about that, about him personally, that you could share?
Well, my family were, their family house was in the Jewish area, and they were what you call modern Orthodox Jews. So they didn't wear the women didn't wear wigs, and they dressed in modern clothes, but they were kosher. And the synagogues, you would have an upstairs for the women, downstairs for the men. But they also were very, very plugged into being British. So there was a huge fight about whether Palestine should become Israel or whether it should remain a perpetual British mandate. So my uncle, he was a star at Hebrew. He won all sorts of elocution contests in English and Hebrew. He had a bad stutter, and he overcame it by winning gold medals in elocution in English and Hebrew. But he was a modern man and a scientific man, and very British. So he straddled both. Yeah. So the state religion was, the state religion was Anglican because it was a colony, but the Jews had a lot of freedom, and they could rise very, very high.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I just love that we have such a wide range of time periods here today, and I will walk over to Sarah now, who will talk about a later time period. So thank you, Loretta, and thank you, Faith, again, and I'll head over here. Hi, Sarah. It's so nice to have you here, too. I'm very excited to hear about your time period, because your book is set much later in time than Faith's and Loretta. So can you tell us about the photograph that's behind you and what the time period is? Please, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Helen, and thank you for organizing this whole event at the Foremothers Café. It's really a great idea. So yeah, so this photograph, it's related thematically to my novel Playground Zero, which was set. It's really a coming of age story set in Berkeley, California, in the late 1960s. And it's told much of it's told from the perspective of kids about the age of the children in this photograph, 11, 12, 13 years old. I chose this photograph, which is, it's the cover of an underground paper published in Berkeley at the time called The Berkeley Tribe. There was another, I think, better known paper called The Berkeley Barb. And those were the two main underground papers at the time. This is it's a posed photograph of three kids hitchhiking seemingly kind of over the hills into Berkeley. And two of the kids, the girl who's seated and the boy on the left with the headband, were a brother and sister who I knew at the time. This was, I think this particular edition of copy was published in the spring of 1970. And they were the children of a man who was known then and then for decades later as the founder of, or one of the founders of, People's Park. People's Park it's very well known to anyone who's ever spent time in Berkeley. I don't know if it's well known elsewhere, and I think not so much, but it was a major kind of political event in Berkeley in the spring of 1969 when a group of people got the idea to take over a block of land that had been made vacant by the university, which was expecting to build student housing on that land. And before the university did that, the land kind of sat fallow for a winter or so, and a group of people got the idea to build a park on it. This happened in April of 1969. The park continued in existence for only a few weeks before the university sent in the middle of the night, police, National Guard, who put up a fence around it, occupied the park. There was a huge demonstration the following day, which turned into probably one of the largest riots in Berkeley at the time. And this was a period when there were many demonstrations, protests, some turning into riots. But this was I lived there at the time as a child, and this was the biggest event of that type that I remember. It's an interesting thing because it's often seen it's sometimes seen as like the original Earth Day event. It's sometimes, not the riot, of course, but the park itself. It's sometimes seen as this one, it's this wonderful sort of, peaceful communal endeavor, which in part it was. But in researching it, I sort of began to think about it, that there was another element, a kind of provocation in it. At that time, there had been National Guard stationed in Berkeley, not on the streets, but just kind of staying nearby. In the aftermath of another set of protests called the Third World Liberation Front, which had been demanding certain changes at the university. And I think that there were people who were actually hoping for some kind of provocation, some kind of event, such as what eventually happened. So anyway, this photograph, it kind of relates thematically to events in my book, because I have a long chapter describing the People's Park riot and placing this brother and sister pair who I kind of used loosely as the basis for characters in my book, they and their father. I kind of placed the kids into the protest, the People's Park protest and the riot, as one of the central events in the book, certainly in terms of public events that I describe. So that's the other.
Yes. So yes, if you want to talk about the other picture that we see in the corner there, the colorful picture, the green and blue and red, orangey photograph.
Sure.
It's gorgeous. If we can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, this is a concert poster for the Fillmore West, which was it was really it was the main concert venue in San Francisco at this time. All the musicians performed there. I went there a number of times myself, as a sixth grader. And there's a scene in my book where the main character, Alice Rayson, goes with a group of kids her age. They're all in 6th grade, and they go to the Fillmore West. So I chose this poster simply because it relates thematically to events in the book. And it's also, I think it's both of these images for me connect to really the main idea behind the book, which is to explore what this environment was like for younger people. Because most of the material that you'll read about this time and place is told from the point of view of people who were, maybe they were students, maybe they were young activists, maybe they were counterculture types in their 20s. But there was this whole world of Berkeley kids, some of whom got very, very far involved in the counterculture, the whole Telegraph Avenue scene, the whole drug scene, the music scene, and it was all kind of happening at once. And the way in which very young people got drawn into it, I think, for me was an interesting thing to explore. So I have scenes with this group of kids that Alice falls in with, including the brother and sister pair from the other photograph, where they go to certain Berkeley landmarks, like they go to the Greek Theater. They take LSD and go to the Greek Theater, which is a big, it's a big outdoor theater, obviously a Greek theater. It's part of the campus. And from that site, which at the time was open to the public, I think now it's fenced and you can't go in, but you could go there, you could go up on the hills above it, and from that vantage point in the late afternoon, there were these incredible views across the bay, the Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco, and Marin County. The whole thing was there. And so I take these kids there in this sort of altered state, and that kind of created a scene there. And I used various other landmarks, from the time, the Fillmore West being one of them, and the whole Telegraph Avenue. I have scenes involving the schools. There was a lot of experimentation going on in the schools. The elementary schools were recently integrated through busing. There were experimental schools, and I have a whole section of the book that is set primarily in an experimental school that was funded by grants, and eventually in the 70s, there was a federal government program, an experimental schools program that included schools of this type in Berkeley and I think several other cities. So there's a lot of history kind of in these events.
Absolutely. Yeah, please go on.
Well, I was going to say that, there are a couple of interesting online resources that I've discovered. One is, there's a Berkeley professor, I think he's in the English department, named Scott Saul, who he and his students have created a website called the Berkeley Revolution. And these are undergraduate students that he's worked with, and they've done a lot of research about Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, and groups that were active there, individuals. There's a section on Girls of Telegraph Avenue. It's kind of interesting material, and they've really done a lot of work. And then there's also a photographer named Nacio Jan Brown, who created a website called Rag Theater. And he spent several years in the late 60s, early 70s, photographing people on Telegraph Avenue, including the kids in the other photograph. And it's, in a way, it's kind of horrifying if you look at it, but it's also interesting simply as documentation of what that whole scene was like at the time. In fact, I think I remember meeting this guy once and desperately trying to evade his camera, which I did evade. So anyway,
Oh, wow.
Those are interesting. They're interesting resources, just visually. And the Scott Saul site has a lot of information, and so it's work done by undergraduates. So it's actually interesting in that way.
Yeah, it's very interesting to look at history, how it actually happened, and even though it's uncomfortable, we learn from seeing that, and the time at that time was very different, and it seems close to us, 1960s, but it's still a few years back now. So we bring up the same questions that I asked Faith and Loretta. And how was religious practice seen at that time when there was so much happening socially that changed so much in that time period, and relationships in general and gay relationships? To me, when I look back at the 60s, I always think, oh, that was time when everything changed and people used their voices, and it seems like it was a very passionate time. Very curious what you have learned in your research about all.
I mean, I'll start with religious. Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing. But I'll just go.
Oh, sure.
Can you hear me?
I hear you fine. Yep.
Okay, I'll just go ahead. So, well, in terms of religious practice, I mean, I think this was a time, mid-20th century, when, you know, conventional religious practice was waning. I mean, there were, I think, fewer people going to church, fewer people who were interested in conventional religion. I mean, this was, I think, less true in the Black community. I think there was more church going, and yeah, I think that was a different situation. But I mean, among the, you know, sort of the counterculture, there, you know, obviously people were not going to church or synagogues but there was a lot of unconventional sort of religious. I don't even know if I would call it religious. I mean, this was the period when the whole sort of growth of cults began, and the Bay Area was one of the centers of that. And you know, so there were groups around kind of doing quasi-religious things. There were the Hare Krishnas, there were the Moonies, there were all these groups, and some of them were really very cult-like. Some of them were sort of political cults, like the whole Jim Jones phenomenon in San Francisco, which began as a church. And so there was a lot of unconventional, quasi-religious, cult-like activity.
Yeah, that's right. I didn't even think of that. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure. And in terms of in terms of relationships, I mean, again, it's a fairly recent period. I think people are aware that this is the time when divorce was becoming much more common, kind of starting in the late 60s. Casual relationships, you know, people sleeping together, you know, partner to partner. I mean, this was fairly common among young people. Gay relationships. I mean, 1969 was also the year of Stonewall, and I remember seeing groups, somewhat theatrical, somewhat activist groups. There was a group called the Cockettes that would come and parade around, and I remember seeing them on the street in Berkeley. They were kind of based in San Francisco, but they were a gay male group. So there was, all of the stuff was fermenting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, another good reminder was Stonewall happened in New York City, where we all are, right. In '69. So that's right.
Right, in Woodstock and Altamont, and I mean, all of these things were happening in 1969, and then yeah.
Yeah, that's really, it's a very good end, I think, to our conversation here, going through these 3 time periods. And if I can just say here that this cafe is set in Sweden, in Lund, in 1918, when there was also a lot of upheaval and movement for women's rights. So it's very fitting that we're all talking about history in here. And thank you so much, all of you, for coming.
That concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society at our website, or contact us at info@hns.nyc.org. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites in the description. Thanks for joining us.